Hey everyone, before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It helps me out a lot and contributes a lot to the channel. Now let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. Twilight stretched across the skies of the Silver Dawn Pack, staining the clouds in soft purples and reds, while the final preparations for the mating ceremony took place in the vast courtyard of the pack house. The gentle glow of fairy lights, woven into arcs of greenery, illuminated rows of chairs arranged in precise lines. An excited hum buzzed through the air as pack members chattered in anticipation of the union that had been planned for months. The word around every table was that tonight would mark the beginning of a new era, uniting not only two families but also solidifying relationships that spanned across the entire region. After all, Lysandra, the renowned daughter of the Bloodrose family, was about to become the mate of Alpha Darius, the most respected leader in the territory. Isadora hovered near the fringes of the gathering, trying her best to seem inconspicuous as she watched servants dart back and forth with trays of refreshments. Although she was the younger sister of Lysandra, a faint sense of detachment always lingered around her. It was not that Isadora lacked beauty or grace. In fact, many had remarked she possessed a quiet loveliness. But Lysandra was the jewel of their family, a warrior spirit bound in alluring charisma. People gravitated to Lysandra like bees to honey, and for years Isadora had accepted her role in the background. Tonight, however, that shadow felt heavier. Perhaps it was because of the significance of the event, or perhaps because her own parents, Mallory and Pierce Bloodrose, had spent the evening doting on Lysandra as if she were made of pure starlight. They fussed over the intricate braids in Lysandra's hair, the arrangement of white wolf lilies around the stage, and even the trail of Lysandra's ceremonial gown, ensuring every detail was perfect for the grand call. Moment. Isadora tried not to feel neglected. She served her usual role, offering help here and there, fetching water when requested, adjusting a flower if it happened to droop. She was used to it and told herself she was content. She continued with these tasks until she glanced across the courtyard and found Lysandra striding forward to greet a new arrival. Darius had arrived, flanked by his beta, Milo, and a few of his loyal guards. Tall and imposing, Darius wore a dark suit that clung to a body honed by countless training sessions. His posture spoke of quiet authority. Each step he took exuded confidence that matched his alpha aura. Dark hair was cropped neatly at the sides, longer at the top, and his eyes, a piercing gray, seemed to analyze everything they landed upon. For a second, his eyes flickered in Isadora's direction. She felt a slight flutter in her stomach. She did not want to be noticed, so she quickly lowered her gaze and made sure she looked busy. "There you are," came a familiar voice behind her. It was Pippa, one of her best friends, an Omega from the pack. Unlike many of the others, Pippa had always taken an interest in Isadora's well-being. "I've been looking for you all evening. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Isadora responded with a soft smile. "It's a big night for Lysandra. I just hope everything goes as planned." Pippa's features turned slightly guarded. "You're not uncomfortable with all this? I mean, everyone is so focused on your sister, but you matter too." Isadora shook her head. "I'm used to it. Lysandra is the shining star of our family, so I'd expect nothing less on her special day. I just want to see her happy and watch her future unfold. She's worked so hard for this." Despite the earnest words, Pippa's concern did not abate. She had seen how often Isadora sacrificed her own chances to shine, stepping aside and letting Lysandra soak in the admiration of everyone around them. But Pippa said no more, simply giving Isadora's hand a squeeze, before heading off to oversee some finishing touches on the table settings. With a quiet sigh, Isadora returned to her discreet tasks, ensuring the food stations had enough napkins, that any scattered rose petals along the aisle were back in place, and that the small string quartet had everything they needed. Occasionally she risked glimpses of Lysandra and Darius. They stood near the fountain, and Lysandra leaned in, a dazzling smile on her lips as she placed her hand lightly on Darius's arm. Anyone could see how charming she could be, how her confidence radiated. Darius, for his part, watched her with a look of polite patience. Though known for his seriousness, he seemed quite willing to indulge Lysandra's excited remarks. When the time for the ceremony approached, a hush fell over the courtyard. The crowd of werewolves, all in human form tonight, in respect for the formal occasion, gathered around the raised dais. Torches were lit to supplement the fairy lights, casting flickering shapes along the columns. The officiant, a stately, older wolf with silver hair named Elder Jonas, stood at the center of the platform. He called for silence with a single sweep of his hand, and the pack obeyed. Isadora tried to stay tucked toward the back, but as family, she had an assigned seat in the front row. She was obliged to walk down one of the side aisles to get to her seat, conscious of every pair of eyes that flicked in her direction. She hoped she could be invisible. She took her place at the corner of the first row, smoothing out her simple pale blue gown. The hush grew more charged when Lysandra made her entrance, stepping onto the dais in flowing ivory, her golden hair styled in a traditional ceremonial fashion. Applause ensued, and Isadora could not help but feel a mixture of pride and envy. After a brief pause, Darius moved to stand beside Lysandra. The crowd waited, breath collectively held, as Elder Jonas began to speak. "We gather under the blessing of the moon goddess to witness the union of two distinguished wolves, Lysandra of the Bloodrose family and Alpha Darius of the Stoneclaw lineage. Their families have long served this pack, protecting our lands and leading us to prosperity. Tonight, we celebrate a bond that is expected to bring about even greater harmony." His gaze swept across the faces of the audience. "By the traditions passed down, I ask that the prospective mates step forward to make their vows." Lysandra turned her face toward Darius, eyes brimming with the confidence of someone who had always envisioned this moment. She was about to speak, but Elder Jonas politely lifted his hand. "Before we begin, we must confirm the mark and the acceptance of the bond in the eyes of the goddess. Darius, if you would, please clasp the hands of your intended mate so that she may receive the sign." Isadora felt her stomach tighten slightly. She knew that the appearance of the mate mark was the moment that truly solidified the connection. A small pang of worry nipped at her. The bond had not yet manifested because, as tradition dictated, it was to appear at the moment of the ceremony under the watchful gaze of the elders. Everyone believed it would bloom across Lysandra's skin, a swirl of silvery lines that marked her as Darius's fated mate. But fate and tradition could sometimes dance to unexpected rhythms. Darius took a breath, turned to Lysandra, and reached for her extended hand. Their fingers touched. The entire courtyard hushed, anticipating the blossoming of a magical insignia. A few seconds passed, then nothing happened. Lysandra's face froze slightly, confusion flickering in her eyes. The crowd exchanged looks, tension rippling in the air. Elder Jonas cleared his throat. "Sometimes it can take a moment, especially if the goddess is..." But suddenly, a strange force seemed to swirl through the courtyard, and Darius's eyes shifted away from Lysandra. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, like he had caught a scent that did not belong to the woman standing before him. A restless energy prickled down his arms, and he turned, searching among the faces in front. The entire crowd sensed that something unorthodox was unfolding. Whispers broke out, even as Lysandra's perfect composure cracked. Isadora, who had been seating at the side, felt her heart pound when Darius's gaze locked onto her. That was impossible, she thought. She was not the chosen bride. She had never even considered herself in any way entangled with him. Yet his wolf was prowling behind his eyes, an unmistakable swirl of silver in the depths. Darius took a step off the dais, as though drawn to a beacon no one else could see. Isadora almost forgot to breathe when she saw him approach. She rose from her seat, but it was more reflex than intent. She felt an invisible tug that made no logical sense. The tension in the courtyard was thick as Darius slowly reached for Isadora's hand. She allowed him to take it, shock rendering her motionless. The moment their skin met, an electric jolt raced up her arm, like sparks igniting the night. She gasped as, before everyone's eyes, a luminous pattern began to form on the back of her hand. It spread along her wrist, as if silver vines were forging a new path. The shock that swept through the crowd was tangible, a collective inhalation that signaled a moment of utter disbelief. Isadora's heart hammered. This was unthinkable. It was Lysandra's mating ceremony. How could the mark appear on Isadora's skin? She locked eyes with Darius, and his expression was an equal mix of astonishment, anger, and something else he did not want to acknowledge. Silence choked the courtyard, broken only by the swirl of wind. It was Elder Jonas who finally found his voice. "The moon goddess has spoken," he said quietly. "Alpha Darius, your true mate is Isadora of the Bloodrose family. The sign is unmistakable." That pronouncement sent ripples of shock and resentment through the gathering. Some looked at Lysandra in pity, others in confusion. Lysandra stared at Isadora with wide eyes, her expression twisting between heartbreak and outrage. Mallory and Pierce, their parents, seemed frozen, struggling to wrap their heads around the situation. As for Darius, a snarl parted his lips. He looked at his own hand, then at Isadora's, as if he wanted to deny what everyone saw, but could not. Isadora's confusion was absolute. She had never once harbored any fantasies of being Darius's mate, had never thought of interfering in her sister's marriage. But now the goddess herself had drawn a line in glowing silver for all to witness. That single moment changed everything. Elder Jonas cleared his throat, trying to retain some semblance of ceremony. In accordance with our ancient traditions, when the mate mark is revealed, the wolves in question are bound. The blessing of the moon goddess cannot be undone by mere mortal will. We must honor what has been decreed. He turned an apprehensive gaze toward Lysandra. "I am sorry for this unexpected turn, child, but the goddess chooses as she wills." Lysandra's face hardened, and for an instant Isadora saw pure rage flicker in her sister's eyes. Then, with a visible effort, Lysandra schooled her features into a mask of controlled fury. "I'm sure there's some mistake," she said through gritted teeth. "There has to be. It is no mistake," Elder Jonas insisted, though his voice was laced with regret. "We cannot proceed with a union that the moon goddess has not sanctioned. The goddess has clearly placed the mark upon Isadora." A wave of stunned agitation rippled through the crowd. Whispers broke out, swirling in every direction. People were speculating, confused, and some were already forming judgments. At the center of it all, Darius looked like he wanted to tear free from his suit and let his wolf vent its frustration. He took a step back, face tight with anger. He exhaled, controlling the edges of a snarl that threatened to escape his lips. Then he turned sharply and walked away from the dais, disappearing into the darkness surrounding the courtyard without another word. Lysandra stared daggers at Isadora before she, too, turned on her heel, storming off amidst gasps and murmurs. Isadora was left standing under the glow of the torchlight, face hot, hand still tingling. She could feel eyes on her, the hush of shock turning into unrestrained gossip. The officiant, the guests, even her own mother and father seemed too stunned to comfort her immediately. Pippa hurried to Isadora's side, expression torn between amazement and concern. "Isa, are you all right?" she asked softly, using the nickname only close friends used. Isadora shook her head, unable to form words. She glanced down, seeing that the mate mark was still there, swirling softly with magical luminescence, a physical declaration of the new bond. Everything had changed in one fleeting instant, and she felt overwhelmed, unable to process the scale of what had just transpired. Finally, Elder Jonas addressed the crowd, calling an end to the ceremony. People dispersed slowly, uncertain how to react. The hush of the courtyard was only broken by hushed gossip. Mallory and Pierce approached Isadora, still in shock, exchanging glances as if trying to figure out how to respond. Pierce gently wrapped an arm around his youngest daughter's shoulders, while Mallory fidgeted with worry. "Isadora, dear, we couldn't have expected," Mallory began. Isadora did not know how to reassure them. She could still feel the pulsing warmth where Darius had touched her, a sign from the goddess that they were tethered in ways the mind could not easily explain. To her parents, she merely offered a shaky nod, tears that refused to fall burning in her eyes. Yes, she had wanted to see Lysandra happy, but never at this cost. Never in a million years had she imagined the bond would manifest for her. The injustice of it seemed crushing, even though deep down, a part of her was curious. But that curiosity was drowned by guilt at having seemingly stolen the future her sister had been preparing for her entire life. Pippa interceded, taking Isadora's arm gently. "We should get her inside," she suggested, glancing around at the prying eyes. Pierce nodded, his face taut with confusion, and led them away from the courtyard. No one could look away from Isadora as she left, the fated but unwelcome new mate of Alpha Darius. Inside the pack house, the halls were lit with soft lanterns. Pippa guided Isadora to her own small sitting room, away from the more public lounge, offering her a glass of water. Isadora took it, barely aware of her trembling fingers. She sank into a cushioned chair, mind spinning. Her father soon entered behind them, looking equally bewildered. "All right," Pierce began quietly, taking a seat. "Let's take a moment. Isadora, do you sense a bond? Beyond the mark, do you feel anything else?" She hesitated, repelling the jolt of electricity, the warmth that suffused her when Darius had touched her. Even now, she could feel her pulse racing, as if part of it responded to his presence, even though he was no longer in the room. "Yes," she whispered. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's there." Pierce gave a grim nod. If the goddess's mark has appeared, then there is no denying it. This is serious. I'm worried about what Lysandra might do. She had the entire ceremony planned. You know how determined she is. That was an understatement, thought Isadora. Lysandra, with her pride and fierce nature, would not easily forgive. Isadora could guess that her sister would see this turn of events as the ultimate betrayal. Even if it was not Isadora's fault, Lysandra was not one to accept the cruelty of fate. She would assign blame somewhere, and Isadora was the most obvious target. Pippa put a hand on Isadora's shoulder. Your sister might cool down with time. Right now, the shock is too fresh." Pierce rubbed his temples, face tense. "And Darius, who knows what he'll do? He's an alpha, and from what I know of him, he is not fond of being forced into anything, even by the will of the goddess." Their conversation lingered on the possibilities until exhaustion pulled at them. Isadora was eventually left alone, though she could not sleep. She lay awake in her room, her mind replaying the moment that changed her entire future. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in her heart: guilt for Lysandra, fear for what Darius might demand. But beneath those stronger emotions was a flicker of unnameable excitement. After all, a wolf's mate is a sacred bond. Most werewolves spent their lives hoping to find that one true partner. And now, unbelievably, Isadora's mate was the alpha who was destined for her sister. She wrestled with those thoughts for hours, drifting in and out of a restless half-sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: dealing with Lysandra's wrath, facing Darius and his inevitable anger, and contending with a pack that had expected something entirely different. She could only hope the bond, forced or not, might one day lead to acceptance. For now, though, the night offered no answers, only the steady hum of her racing mind and the faint glow of the mate mark etched on her skin. Sunlight pierced the windows of Isadora's bedroom the next morning, bringing with it the reality of the impossible bond that had shaken the entire pack. She stirred in her bed, blinking sleep from her eyes, only to remember the swirl of silver that had burned its way across her skin in front of everyone. She raised her hand and saw the pattern faintly illuminated, the constant reminder that she was now tied to the alpha. Anxiety tugged at her chest. She could not ignore the bond, but she also felt a nauseating wave of guilt. Lysandra had to be furious. She glanced at the clock. It was earlier than she usually woke, but she knew returning to sleep would be futile. Rising, she slipped into a loose-fitting sweater over a pair of jeans, not bothering to dress up. She tried to steady her nerves, telling herself she would have to face the consequences eventually. Emerging from her bedroom, she navigated the narrow corridor that led to the main floor, where family members usually gathered in the mornings. The house seemed unusually quiet. She wondered if her parents had gone to comfort Lysandra, or if they were simply too overwhelmed to function normally. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she ran into her mother, Mallory, who was pacing by the front door. The older woman's face showed a mix of concern, exhaustion, and perhaps a touch of anger. When she spotted Isadora, Mallory rushed forward. "Oh, you're up," she said, eyes darting to the mark on Isadora's hand. "We need to speak, dear. Everything is in disarray right now." A wave of emotion made Mallory's voice tremble. "This entire situation is so unexpected." Isadora nodded, already feeling a rock in the pit of her stomach. "Mother, I'm sorry. I never wanted this." "I know, Lysandra." Mallory held up a hand. "I know it wasn't your fault. The bond is something beyond our control. But your sister—" She paused, frowning. "She hasn't come out of her room since last night. She's livid. She's even refusing to talk to me. She said she wants to handle this her way. I'm trying to give her space, but we're worried about what she might do." The sense of dread rose within Isadora. She had grown up watching Lysandra's determined and sometimes vindictive nature. "What about father?" she asked quietly, glancing around. "He's out trying to talk with members of the pack. Rumors are swirling, and we can't afford a scandal." Mallory's lips pressed into a thin line. "Darius is an alpha, and the future of the pack rests with him. Everyone expects him to accept his fated mate, but he's not the type to yield easily. especially considering how he was first promised to your sister. The pack, too, is confused. Some question the will of the goddess, while others see your sister's heartbreak and blame you. We must remain calm, but above all, we must ensure you are safe." A twinge of anxiety shot through Isadora at the idea of not being safe, but she managed a nod, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. "All right," she whispered. "I'll keep my head down. Maybe eventually they'll understand." Mallory sighed, her gaze filled with motherly worry. "Nothing is that simple, my dear. I'm going to try once more to speak with Lysandra. Please stay here, or find somewhere quiet in the house if you prefer, but avoid stirring up any more discussion. Let your father do what he can to ease the tensions, and if you see Darius, just be cautious." With that, Mallory moved upstairs, leaving Isadora in the empty foyer. Taking a moment to steady herself, she stepped through the corridors until she reached a small parlor where she hoped to find some solitude. She had not taken more than a few steps into the room when she saw Lysandra there, standing near a window. The oldest sister was dressed in a robe of midnight blue silk, her hair loose and tumbling over her shoulders. She turned abruptly at the sound of Isadora's footsteps, her face pale but composed in a dangerously controlled manner. Isadora hesitated, wondering if she should back away, but Lysandra, arms crossed, had already seen her. They locked gazes for a moment. A swirl of old memories flashed through Isadora's mind, moments where Lysandra had protected her from bullies or teased her playfully. But this was a Lysandra fueled by a sense of betrayal. The gentle nostalgia was replaced by immediate tension. "You're the last person I want to see," Lysandra said coldly, each word biting. Her eyes flicked to the faint glow on Isadora's hand. "But here you are, wearing my mark. I never asked for this," Isadora whispered, voice trembling. "Lysandra, I'm so sorry. I know you must be devastated." Her sister let out a bitter laugh. "Devastated doesn't begin to describe it. Humiliated, enraged, confused. My entire future was laid out. A future with Darius, uniting our families, leading the pack. And then, in front of everyone, Mark shows up on you. Now." She practically spat the last word. "Do you even understand what that does to me?" Tears pricked Isadora's eyes. "I wish I could undo it for your sake, but the bond, it's the will of the goddess. It's not something I manipulated or, don't speak to me about the goddess's will," Lysandra snapped, stepping closer so that Isadora could feel the heat of her anger. "I was always the one fated to be a leader, to stand beside an alpha. You," she jabbed a pointed finger at Isadora's chest, "you were the quiet shadow, the forgettable younger sister. This is obscene. It can't be real." Isadora found a flare of frustration rising. She understood Lysandra's pain, but she was not made of stone either. "We both saw the mark appear on my skin the moment Darius touched me. You think I wanted to steal your moment? I never did. I hate that this happened, but you can't blame me for it." Lysandra's eyes glittered with tears she refused to shed. "Ah, I can blame you," she hissed, "because you've taken what was mine. The entire pack sees you as the fated mate now. Don't think I won't fight this." A chill went through Isadora at the promise in her sister's voice. "Lysandra, please. I'm your sister. I never wanted any of this. If we could reverse it," but Lysandra's rage was too raw. "I said I'd handle this my way. Watch your back, little sister. The Alpha might be obligated to you by some cosmic joke, but this story isn't over." Before Isadora could say another word, Lysandra stormed out of the parlor, leaving an ominous quiet in her wake. Isadora stood there, heart pounding, emotions tangled between sorrow, fear, and an odd indignation at being so viciously blamed. She realized that no matter what she said or did, Lysandra might never let go of her resentment, and that would cause rifts not only within their family, but possibly within the pack as well. The morning crawled by, with Isadora avoiding the prying gazes of staff and visitors. Eventually, around midday, she heard from Pippa, who had ventured outside and discovered that Darius was holding a small audience in the packhouse courtyard to address the rumors. Some of the higher-ranked wolves, including her father, were there to try to maintain peace. Isadora considered hiding away, but she knew she had to face the reality sooner or later. Mustering her courage, she left the house and made her way toward the courtyard. Immediately, she could tell the mood was tense. A ring of wolves stood near the tall hedges, exchanging anxious looks as Darius spoke to Pierce and Beta Milo at the center. Darius was in casual clothes, black pants, and a fitted dark shirt, but he radiated authority. The faint lines on his face spoke of anger. Isadora approached slowly, wondering if she would go unnoticed amidst the small crowd. But Darius spotted her instantly, as if drawn by the same invisible force that had awakened during the ceremony. His gray eyes flickered with a swirl of contradictory emotions, fury, reluctance, and, beneath it all, an undeniable, primal pull. She swallowed, bracing herself. She was close enough now to hear Darius's words. Respect the will of the goddess, but this entire turn of events, his jaw clenched. I don't appreciate being blindsided. My agreement with Lysandra was quite clear. Now the entire ceremony is in shambles. I know the mark is on Isadora, but I refuse to simply accept that my life can be derailed like this. I was raised to lead, not to be manipulated by fate. It stung Isadora to hear that. She knew the bond was unwelcome to him, just as it was unwelcome to Lysandra. And yet, hearing him almost accuse her of playing a role in this twist burned. Pierce offered a calm, fatherly approach. Alpha, I understand. This is a complicated situation, but you cannot deny that the goddess's bond is the cornerstone of our pack's tradition. No one forced the mark. We must find a way to honor it, or at least come to terms with it. Darius's expression tightened. I never wanted Isadora as a mate. No offense, but my arrangement was with Lysandra. His gaze briefly flicked to Isadora, who stood on the perimeter, heartbreak and embarrassment plain on her features. A hush fell over those gathered, many of whom had only just noticed she was there. Darius exhaled, frustration etched along his brow. If the bond is real, the question is what to do now. The pack expects an Alpha Luna union, but I have no interest in it happening this way. He looked directly at Isadora this time, his wolf swirling in his eyes. She could feel the power of that gaze, like a tangible weight. I suppose you want answers as much as I do. Isadora mustered her courage. I only know that the goddess chose to put the mark on me, she said softly, yet her voice rang in the still courtyard. I wish I had an explanation as to why. I never planned to take anything from Lysandra, and I don't want to cause trouble for you or the pack. Darius's lip curled slightly, as if he wanted to dismiss her words. But perhaps the wolf in him recognized the sincerity in her tone. I see. Well, trouble has found us regardless. The entire pack is talking, and we don't have the luxury of ignoring this. We need to figure out the next step. The official stance is that you are my fated mate. That means, in the eyes of the elders, you have a claim as my Luna. but do not imagine that I accept this easily. If the goddess has made some cosmic error, I intend to explore any possibility of undoing it." A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the onlookers, many of whom were devout believers in the immutability of the mate bond. Still, Darius's authority was not to be questioned lightly, and so no one openly contradicted him. Pierce dared to speak up, concern threading his words. "Alpha, if you try to break the mate bond, it goes against everything we stand for. The process is dangerous. The goddess does not take kindly to having her will cast aside." Darius's nostrils flared. "Better to risk that than to be saddled with a mate I never chose. No offense, but your daughter was never part of my plan." Isadora felt a stab of pain at his words. She clenched her fists, swallowing a surge of emotions. She understood he was angry, but hearing him say it so bluntly in front of the entire gathering still stung. She saw Milo, Darius's beta, step forward with a hand on the Alpha's arm, as if to urge caution. Milo cast a sympathetic glance in Isadora's direction, acknowledging how harsh his Alpha's words sounded. "Darius," Milo said carefully, "perhaps it's best if we continue these discussions privately. The pack is already on edge, and they need reassurance. Barging ahead with talk of severing a bond might cause chaos." Darius glowered at the mention of chaos. "Fine." He relented, turning to Isadora. "We'll discuss this further in private. For now, the official word is that the ceremony is postponed while we investigate. Let everyone know they should get back to their tasks. Beta, I want you to keep an eye on the territory borders. Distractions like this can invite opportunistic rogues." Milo nodded, and with that, Darius stalked off, leaving Isadora standing amidst a swirl of uncertain pack members. The crowd began to disperse, each person with their own mixture of shock and curiosity. Isadora's father approached, the lines of worry deepening on his face. "He's rattled," Pierce murmured, trying to offer comfort. "Give him time." She nodded mutely, unable to articulate the messy ball of emotions swirling inside her. Suddenly, she spotted Lysandra watching from a distance, her face unreadable. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Isadora thought she saw pure hatred gleaming behind her sister's mask. A chill ran down her spine. Then Lysandra was gone, slipping between two bystanders and out of sight. Isadora's tension did not ease. She had the terrible sense that her sister's next move would be a calculated strike. That afternoon, to escape the oppressive atmosphere in the pack house, Isadora found a quiet spot under a large oak near the training fields. The sun was warm on her face, but a soft breeze kept the air cool. She used to love coming to this spot as a child to watch the older wolves spar, imagining that one day she might be brave and strong like them. Now she was sitting there to nurse confusion and heartbreak. Her mind wandered to the new bond that refused to be ignored. A subtle pulse in her chest reminded her of Darius's presence, as if a faint thread connected them. She doubted he felt it the same way, or if he did, he despised it. Closing her eyes, she tried to find some sense of solace. But her thoughts drifted to Lysandra's threatening words, Darius's dismissive attitude, and the question of how she was supposed to navigate a future she never asked for. A rustling sound made her eyes snap open. She turned and saw Beta Milo approaching, hands in his pockets, a cautious yet friendly expression on his face. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding at the patch of grass next to her. She offered a small smile. "Sure." He eased himself down, crossing his legs. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Eventually, Milo broke the silence. You know, I've known Darius practically my whole life. We grew up together. I've never seen him so unsure of what to do." Isadora let out a soft sigh, gazing at the horizon where the sun was dipping. "He made it clear he's not happy about being bound to me." Milo studied her face. "He's angry." "That's true. Darius doesn't like surprises, and this is the biggest surprise of his life. He's not used to feeling powerless. That's what the mate bond does. In a way, it sets a path that neither wolf can easily change." She picked at a blade of grass, letting it slip through her fingers. "Are you here to tell me to back off or stay out of his way?" Milo shook his head. "No, I'm here because I think you deserve at least some explanation for what's going on in his mind. He had plans. You know, with Lysandra, alliances, expanding the pack's territory, forging stronger ties with neighboring packs. It wasn't just a marriage of convenience. Though, I think he genuinely admired Lysandra's strength and believed they'd make a good leadership pair. Now everything is upended. He's not sure how to handle it." She looked away. "I never wanted to ruin that for him, or for Lysandra. It just happened." Milo nodded. I believe you, and so does part of Darius, I think. But he's got that alpha mindset. He feels cornered, and cornered wolves snarl first, then think later. A sad smile ghosted over her lips. "I think I saw that snarl already." Chuckling lightly, Milo pressed on. "Despite that, I know Darius respects the mate bond. We were raised in the old traditions. He might be talking about severing it, but deep down, that goes against everything he believes. He'll fight himself just as much as he'll fight you." Isadora exhaled. "And what about the pack? People must be talking. Many will be disappointed that Lysandra isn't the one they'll call Luna." "True," Milo admitted. They had grown used to that idea. But the pack also believes strongly in the will of the goddess. If it becomes clear that you and Darius really are fated, they'll adapt. The real question is whether Darius is going to accept it or not. And, of course, if your sister tries to stir up trouble." A tightness settled in her chest at the mention of Lysandra. "She's already threatened me. I'm worried about what she'll do next." Milo tilted his head. "You should be cautious. Lysandra is known to be strong-willed and can hold a grudge. But you have your own strength, Isadora, even if you don't realize it. The bond itself might awaken abilities or instincts you haven't tapped into yet." She frowned. "Abilities?" He shrugged. "Some wolves experience heightened senses or unusual skills when the mate bond is new, especially in unions involving an alpha. Trust your instincts, Isadora. The goddess wouldn't have given you that mark if you weren't meant for it in some way." She pondered his words, feeling a sliver of relief that at least someone believed she could handle this. Milo rose to his feet, dusting the grass off his pants. "I should get back. I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're not sitting here feeling like you're alone in this mess." A faint smile formed on her lips. "Thank you, Milo. That means a lot." With a polite nod, he headed back in the direction of the pack house, leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. This time, the weight on her shoulders felt a shade lighter. Though the situation remained tangled, at least she was not completely isolated. If she could garner Milo's sympathy, maybe others in the pack would come to accept her. The real challenge was to see if Darius could do the same, and if Lysandra would relent. Considering the glimmer of rage she had seen in her sister's eyes, that seemed less likely. Isadora stood and walked along the edge of the training field. She paused to watch a group of wolves, mostly teenagers, practicing forms with wooden staffs. Their moves were choreographed, taught by an older instructor shouting encouragement and corrections. Some turned to look at her, curiosity evident in their expressions. She offered a small wave, and a few hesitantly waved back. Word traveled fast in the pack, and no doubt all of them knew about the fiasco of the mating ceremony. She lingered for a moment, recalling her own training years ago. She had never been as gifted a fighter as Lysandra, but she held her own in basic self-defense. Her slight frame and preference for quiet study made her the calmer sibling. She doubted she could claim a warrior's skill like her sister, but the memory reminded her that she was not without resources. She had her own mind, her own resilience. And now, apparently, a mate bond with an alpha that might yet unlock something in her. The sun was dipping low, so she turned back toward the house, feeling the approach of evening. She knew the day had only partially played out. There would be more closed-door discussions, more tension in the family. She could only brace herself for whatever was coming next. As the sky darkened, Isadora found herself in the small library on the second floor of the pack house. She wandered among the tall shelves, running her fingers over the spines of old books that had been passed down for generations. The place smelled of parchment and wood polish, a comforting sanctuary from the chaos outside. She chose a worn volume about the lore of the mate bond, thinking perhaps there might be some precedent or story that mirrored her predicament. She sat at a table and flipped through the pages, pausing now and then at passages detailing blessings, curses, and the ways in which an alpha's mate might influence the entire pack's destiny. She was so absorbed in her reading that she jumped slightly when she felt a presence behind her. Spinning around, she saw Darius leaning against a shelf, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Her heart lurched. The sense of the bond intensified in his presence, stirring a warmth that resonated just beneath her skin. She closed the book, trying to compose herself. "Alpha," she said softly. He surveyed her for a moment, the lines of his face betraying a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "I didn't expect to find you here." She cleared her throat. "I was trying to understand our situation better, reading about the mate bond." His eyes flicked to the old tome. "Did you find anything useful?" She let out a small sigh. "Mostly theories on how powerful the bond can be, especially with an alpha. I haven't found a case exactly like ours. Usually, the bond is something celebrated, not," she searched for the right word, "not complicated like this." Darius stepped closer, the subtle heat of his body radiating toward her. "Everything about this is complicated. My entire future, turned on its head in a single night. I had a plan, Isadora. I was going to ally with your sister, expand my territory, protect the pack from outside threats. We would have been unstoppable as a pair. Now everything is uncertain." She swallowed, meeting his gaze. "I understand. I never meant to ruin those plans." He shook his head, exhaling slowly. "I know that. It's not your fault. The bond is the bond. But that doesn't make me any less frustrated." Silence pressed between them. She mustered the courage to ask a question that had been brewing. "Are you really considering severing it?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes, in the soft lamplight of the library, gleamed with an inner conflict. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "I don't know. The pack has strong views on that. My father would have never forgiven me if he were still alive. To break the mate bond, and if we attempt it, and it fails, the consequences can be severe. But I can't pretend I'm ready to accept you as my mate, and the future Luna, my Wolfa." He trailed off, eyes darkening. My wolf is furious at being denied what it wants. And what it wants is to complete the bond, to claim you, to ensure no one else can have you. Yet my human side rebels at the idea. Isadora's breath caught at the raw honesty. A flicker of something ignited in her chest, an awareness of the primal connection they shared, no matter how undesired it might be on the surface. "Darius," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't pretend to know how this ends, but I promise I'm not here to sabotage your life. If you need time, I'll give it." He studied her for a moment. Then, in a move that surprised her, he reached out and gently took her hand, the one bearing the faint glow of the mate mark. She felt the same surge of electricity as when it first appeared. She watched his face tense, as though the power of the bond was more than he wanted to handle. For an instant, she thought he might pull away, but instead, he ran his thumb over the swirling lines, exhaling slowly. "It's real," he muttered, eyes distant, as if talking to himself. "I can feel it like a drumbeat in my blood." She nodded, heart pounding as if it might burst. "Yes, I can too." Their eyes met, and for one surreal moment, the tension between them hovered at the edge of something else, something that might have been acceptance, maybe even longing. But he released her hand and stepped back, letting the air rush in to fill the space between them. "I still have to speak with the elders, consult the archives, and figure out if there's any recourse," Darius stated, resuming the clipped tone of an alpha delivering orders. "Meanwhile, you'll remain here. The pack will watch closely. Make sure you're taken care of." Isadora sensed he was about to leave, so she ventured one last question. "And Lysandra?" His jaw tightened. "She's wounded, and she'll want vengeance, but she's still part of the Bloodrose family. She'll have supporters in the pack, maybe even people who prefer her to be Luna. Tread carefully." She nodded, accepting his warning as well as the heavy reality of the situation. He gave her one last unreadable look before turning and striding out of the library. Isadora stood there, heart racing, the warm tingle of his touch still resonating across her skin. No matter how thorny the path ahead, the mate bond was like a cord tying them together, a cord that refused to be neatly cut. In the hush of the old library, she allowed herself a single tear of uncertainty, wishing she could see the future. The only thing she knew for sure was that from now on, nothing about her life would be the same. The days following the abrupt end to Lysandra's mating ceremony passed in a thick swirl of tension that suffocated every corridor of the pack house and reverberated through the Silver Dawn pack. From the top-ranking elders to the newest recruits, everyone felt the strain. At the center of it all was Isadora, wrestling with the paradox of an unwanted mate bond that only grew stronger each time she felt Alpha Darius's presence near her. Whispers slithered through the hallways, some supportive of the moon goddess's choice, others outraged on behalf of Lysandra, whose ambitions to become Luna were so spectacularly crushed. The resulting conflict turned daily life into a series of uneasy interactions and uncertain alliances. By midday one morning, Isadora found herself in an unremarkable side lounge on the second floor, trying to snatch a moment of peace. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. She had settled on a couch near a window that overlooked the training yard, where she saw wolves honing their combat skills under the direction of Beta Milo and a couple of seasoned lieutenants. The faint clang of practice swords drifted upward, a rhythmic backdrop to the ache in her heart. She cradled a cup of tea in her hands, trying to focus on the steam. The swirling vapors rose in fragile coils, reflecting how she felt, at once tangible and ready to vanish at the slightest disturbance. Before she could lose herself in thought, her father, Pierce, strode into the lounge, shoulders squared and expression troubled. He was still imposing, a broad-shouldered wolf, with streaks of gray in his hair and a quiet dignity that had seen him through battles decades past. He paused when he saw her, weighing the concern etched on her face. With a heavy sigh, he crossed the room and sank into a seat opposite her. "I can't remember a time the pack was this uneasy," Pierce said, running a hand along his jawline. He eyed her carefully. "How are you holding up?" Isadora set her teacup aside with trembling fingers, her honest worry spilling out before she could temper it. "I'm not sure. Every time I walk into the corridor, I can feel the stares. People are torn between wanting to respect the mate bond and resenting me for shattering Lysandra's future. Father, half of them expect me to slip away in disgrace, and the other half seem to think I have some cunning plan to secure Darius for myself." Pierce's mouth tightened at the corners. "This pack respects the will of the goddess. In time, they might come to see you as Luna, but the transition will be rocky, especially when Lysandra won't stop stoking her own grudges. I've seen her meet with some of the more outspoken elders, the ones who were always invested in her union with Darius. She is trying to sway them to her side." The mere mention of Lysandra's active meddling made Isadora's stomach clench. She still recalled the venom in her sister's tone, the promise that she would handle things her own way. "I don't know if I can face her," she admitted softly, looking down at her hands. "She blames me, and I can't say I blame her for being angry, but she has all the power of her social standing and her old alliances to back her up. All I have is a bond nobody wanted." Pierce leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees in a posture of paternal comfort. "You are stronger than you think, and you do have allies. Your mother and I may be confused by what happened, but we don't doubt you or your good intentions. Pippa has been supportive, and Milo seems concerned as well. Give it time. And remember, you're a blood rose. Our line has never shied away from the challenges of fate." Warmth flickered in Isadora's chest at his words, but no sooner had she begun to draw comfort from them than she sensed a shift in the air. The door opened, and Darius stepped into the lounge, exuding the casual authority that characterized him. His gaze was intense, flicking from father to daughter. She felt the bond stir under her skin, that invisible tether tugging taut. Pierce stood, offering a slight bow of respect to the alpha, then excused himself with a murmured goodbye, leaving Isadora alone with the man who was both her fated mate and her fiercest critic. Darius remained silent for a moment, as though assessing whether this conversation would bring any clarity or simply ignite further friction. Isadora collected herself and shifted on the couch, looking up at him. He approached slowly, each footstep a reminder of the pent-up energy coiled inside him. When he spoke, his voice was low, like a thundercloud ready to release rain. "We need to talk about this situation. Lysandra is sowing dissent, and it's causing too much turmoil in the pack." "I expected as much," Isadora replied, struggling to keep her tone calm. "She has every reason to be angry. She was the one you planned to mate with." "Yes, she was," Darius said, choosing not to mince words. His jaw clenched for a moment. "But the fact remains that the mate bond formed with you, not her. I can feel it constantly. My wolf roars for me to claim you, to secure you, but every time I think about giving in, I remember how carefully I prepared for a future that did not include you." Hearing the bluntness of his inner battle always stung, but she was trying to brace herself for it. She folded her hands in her lap, noticing the faint glow still shimmering on the back of her hand. I understand. If there was some easy way to break the bond, you would probably do it already. But there is no easy way. You are caught between your wolf's instincts and your ambitions for the pack, and I am the inconvenient piece. Fate threw in. He raked a hand through his hair, exhaling heavily. I have spoken with Elder Jonas and others about the potential to sever the bond. They all warned me that the cost is unpredictable. The goddess's wrath, the strain on our wolves, even the possibility that it could weaken my leadership. I cannot lead a pack if my spirit is in turmoil. She nodded, sadness and relief mingling in her heart. Sadness that he clearly would have gone through with it if it were easy, and relief that it was not so simple to discard what was, despite all the tension, a sacred bond. I do not envy your predicament, she murmured, but it is also my predicament. If you think it's comfortable for me to wear the mark while being seen as an obstacle, then you are mistaken. He studied her, as though seeing her frustration for the first time. A tension flickered across his face. I never asked if you even wanted to remain bound. Has the thought crossed your mind, to try and break it yourself? Isadora let out a shaky breath, emitting the half-formed thoughts that haunted her sleepless nights. Yes, it has, but I was raised to honor the goddess's decisions. And if there is even a fraction of a chance this bond is part of some bigger design, I cannot bring myself to shatter it out of fear or guilt. I don't want to be your enemy, Darius. I don't want to be your regret. He was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she had overstepped by bearing her vulnerability like that. But instead of snapping at her, he moved to a nearby chair and sat, resting his elbows on his thighs. His head tilted down slightly, as if weighed by conflicting thoughts. Part of me wants to accept this, to accept you. My wolf is certain you belong to me, but I have carried the idea of Lysandra at my side for so long, and we had an understanding, a mutual respect. Now, it feels like I have betrayed her, and I hate it. The pack looks at me, half waiting for me to decree that you will be Luna, half expecting me to reverse the entire fiasco. She sighed, a heavy ache settling in her chest. No matter what you choose, someone will be unhappy. But you said yourself that your wolf wants this bond. Why not let your instincts guide you? A flicker of something close to pain crossed his features. Because I do not want my instincts alone to define my leadership. I have to weigh what is best for everyone, not just my wolf's desires. And there is another concern, one I have not fully voiced. Even if I accept the bond, what if you are not strong enough to shoulder the demands of being Luna? A mate who cannot protect the pack or command respect might be a liability. Lysandra was formidable, a proven warrior. You, from what I know, keep to the sidelines. The criticism stung, but Isadora braced herself. I have never led before, that is true, but I am not defenseless, and I am not incompetent. I simply never had the chance to prove myself. The pack has always looked at Lysandra first. I doubt anyone, including our parents, thought I would ever stand in your place. But let me remind you, Luna's power is not measured solely by skill in battle or intimidation. There is more to leadership than brute force. His gaze sharpened slightly, something about her earnest tone striking a chord. Still, skepticism lingered. Perhaps, but in these lands, the threat of rogue attacks, disputes with neighboring packs, even the tension among our own ranks, all require a decisive and strong hand. If you cannot fight, how can you protect yourself or the wolves who look to you for guidance? A defensive spark flared in Isadora. I know the basics of combat. I was trained, albeit not with the same intensity as Lysandra. And if being your mate, being Luna, demands more, then I am willing to learn. But it will be difficult if you refuse to give air. Me a chance." He hesitated, and something akin to respect flickered in his expression. "So, you are willing to prove yourself?" "Yes," she answered quietly but firmly. "I may not relish violence, but I will defend this pack if needed. If we truly are bound, then I owe it to the goddess, to the wolves, and to myself to not remain complacent." His posture shifted, as though the barriers he had built were no longer so immovable. "Very well. I can arrange for you to train more rigorously. If you truly wish to test your capabilities, I will not stop you. But be warned, the standards for an alpha's mate are extremely high. We don't offer special favors or easy passes." She tilted her chin up. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Despite the fear and doubt swirling within her, a newfound determination took root. Darius was granting her a grudging chance to prove she could stand beside him, not as a figurehead, but as a genuine partner in leadership. A small seed of hope unfurled in her chest, though she knew it would be a precarious path. If she succeeded, perhaps she could bridge the chasm that separated them. If she failed, it could cost her not only her position, but also the respect of the entire pack that was so closely watching. Darius rose from the chair, regarding her with a final, thoughtful look. "Tomorrow morning, be in the training yard at dawn. I will have Milo arrange a regimen for you. This is your chance, Isadora. If you truly believe you were chosen to be my mate, let your actions speak louder than your apologies." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the lounge, leaving her heart pounding and her mind racing. For the first time since the ill-fated ceremony, a spark of purpose lit up her senses, offsetting the anxiety swirling around her. She had a task now, a way to channel her uncertainty into something tangible. The path to acceptance, however, was marred by obstacles. Lysandra's anger, the skepticism of the pack, and the reluctance of Darius himself. Yet the bond glowed on the back of her hand, fueling her resolve. Perhaps, she thought, this was the beginning of forging a relationship with her fated mate that was more than forced duty. That night, while the pack house gradually settled into its usual hush, Isadora retreated to her bedroom. She tried to ignore the swirl of tension that clung to every conversation in the corridors, focusing instead on what lay ahead. If Darius expected her to prove she could be strong enough to bear the Luna title, she would do her best to rise to the challenge. She even caught herself whispering a small prayer to the moon goddess, asking for courage and clarity. Her entire life had been overshadowed by Lysandra's brilliance, yet perhaps she had a reservoir of resilience that even she did not fully realize. She spent the remaining hours before bedtime rummaging through old notes on combat technique, the ones she had half forgotten since her younger days in mandatory training sessions. She recalled the times she had practiced with staff and daggers, usually overshadowed by Lysandra, who excelled in every physical contest. The memory made her chest tighten, but it also reminded her that she had begun with the same foundation as any other werewolf her age. If she set her mind to it, maybe she could surpass her own limitations. When she finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were a jumble of half-familiar images. The swirling lines of her mate Mark, the imposing figure of Darius, her sister's scowling face, and the moon goddess's presence, looming in silver moonlight. Though disjointed, a sense of urgency permeated those dreams, urging her to be ready for what was coming. She awoke before dawn, heart hammering in her chest, and realized she was equal parts frightened and excited. Throwing on simple training clothes, she slipped out of her room and made her way through the still, silent halls, the hush broken only by the occasional crack of the old wooden floorboards and her own anxious heartbeat. In the courtyard, the early morning air held a crisp chill. The sky was still a pre-dawn charcoal, with faint streaks of orange and pink just beginning to edge the horizon. She saw Milo waiting under one of the torches near the large training yard, flanked by 2 pack warriors who looked half asleep but alert enough. Darius was nowhere to be seen, but Isadora felt the bond faintly pulling somewhere near, as though he might be watching from the shadows or from an upper window. "Good morning," she greeted quietly, hoping her nerves did not show too clearly. "I am ready to start." Milo offered a small smile that contained a trace of encouragement. "So the rumors are true. Darius wants you to train. I was not sure if you would actually come. Some might be too intimidated to show up at this hour." She exhaled, pushing down any intimidation. "I have to prove myself, right? Better to start early." He gestured toward a line of equipment. Training dummies, spears, short blades, and a stack of smaller wooden practice weapons. "We'll begin with evaluating your current skill set. I need to see where you stand in terms of technique, speed, and stamina. After that, we can tailor a regimen that challenges you to grow quickly." With Milo's direction, Isadora began a series of basic drills, thrusting and parrying with a short wooden sword that was weighted to simulate a real blade. She moved through stances she had not practiced in years, struggling at first to recall the proper footwork. Milo circled her, occasionally stopping to reposition her arm or correct the angle of her sword. The early morning sun slowly rose above the horizon, bathing the yard in a golden light that revealed sweat beading on her brow. Her muscles burned with the effort of repetition, yet, instead of giving in to fatigue, she found herself strangely exhilarated. She realized how much she had stifled any desire to stand out in physical endeavors. Now, she was letting that side of her surface. After a time, Milo paused the exercise and beckoned forward one of the 2 warriors, a broad-shouldered woman named Alina. "Let's see how you handle a sparring partner," he said, handing Alina another wooden sword. "Go easy on her at first, then ramp up." Alina nodded, stepping onto the makeshift sparring circle they had traced in the dirt. Isadora swallowed, steeling herself. She had no illusions that she could outmatch a trained warrior, but she wanted to demonstrate at least some measure of competence. Milo gave the signal, and Alina lunged, swinging at Isadora with a swift arc. Isadora dodged, though her footwork was not as clean as she hoped. She countered with a hesitant slash, which Alina easily deflected. The clang of wood meeting wood echoed in the crisp air. Time seemed to blur as they exchanged blows, each testing the other's reflexes. Alina gradually increased speed and pressure. Isadora found herself backpedaling more often than not, but she forced herself to stay focused, adjusting her stance to maintain balance. She blocked one strike overhead, then pivoted to the side, aiming for Alina's flank. Alina evaded with practiced ease and quickly brought her sword around, tapping Isadora on the shoulder. A point for Alina. They reset and continued. Though Isadora never truly gained the upper hand, she avoided sloppy mistakes. Her mind buzzed with adrenaline, and while her arms trembled from the strain, a spark of satisfaction lit her chest. She was fighting, truly fighting, and it felt oddly liberating, as though some dormant facet of her spirit was waking. After a few more rounds, Milo called it to a stop. Alina gave a respectful nod to Isadora, who panted lightly. "Not bad," Alina said, sincerity in her voice. "You have a quick mind. Once you build confidence in your strokes, you could hold your own against lesser rogues." Isadora smiled despite the sweat clinging to her hairline. "Thank you," she managed between breaths. Milo then indicated a small break. As she caught her breath, she noticed a figure standing farther off near the hedges. It was Darius. He had his arms crossed, observing with an unreadable expression that could have been approval or cold evaluation. She felt her heart pick up pace, that ever-present awareness of his nearness intensifying. She walked over, still holding the wooden sword, trying to mask the trembling in her arms. "You came to watch?" she asked, a little breathless. He gave a slight nod, eyes roaming over the sweat on her skin and the determined set of her features. "I wanted to see if you would actually show. You did, and you did not give up." A self-conscious flush touched her cheeks. "I have to start somewhere." He looked at the blade in her hand, then met her gaze. "You need more work, more precision, but I can see you have a willingness to learn. Keep showing up, keep pushing yourself. Let that be the measure of your resolve." Isadora nodded, ignoring the sting of pride at his curt manner. She silently vowed to train until her muscles screamed, if that was what it took to earn a place by his side. Even as she made that vow, a tiny part of her heart whispered that this was not simply about the pack's acceptance. It was also about glimpsing Darius's reluctant respect, about eroding the walls he had put up. She wanted to prove she could be someone he could rely on, even admire. The next few days fell into a pattern of grueling training sessions, stealthily avoided confrontations with Lysandra, and polite but tense interactions with other pack members. Isadora rose before dawn to meet Milo, Alina, and occasionally another warrior or two in the training yard. She learned to spar with a variety of weapons, practiced evasion drills, and even tested her abilities in partial wolf form. The mental strain was as taxing as the physical demands, yet there was a fierce sense of purpose in each day's routine. She also noticed that, in subtle ways, some wolves in the pack began to show a cautious openness toward her. Where before they stared at her with pity or suspicion, a few now greeted her with reserved nods. Gossip still soared, but occasionally Pippa brought word that certain elders were impressed by Isadora's dedication. Another intangible shift she felt was her growing bond with Darius. Their interactions remained marked by tension, but each time they crossed paths, she sensed something unspoken pass between them, like an electric current. She would catch him watching her spar from a distance, or she would see the flicker of recognition in his eyes when they talked about pack matters in front of others. It was as if, despite his efforts to remain cold, his wolf was forging a connection that neither of them could deny. However, no amount of training or subtle acceptance could shield Isadora from the brewing storm that was Lysandra's resentment. Shortly after sunset one evening, as Isadora returned from the yard, exhausted and sore, she decided to freshen up before dinner. She chose a secluded corridor to head to her room, not wanting to draw attention with her sweaty clothes and bruised arms. Halfway down the hallway, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled, a sign of another wolf's presence. She turned, and there was Lysandra, stepping out from the shadows with a predatory grace. The older sister wore a sleek outfit of black pants and a fitted top, her hair swept back from her face in a fierce ponytail. Tension coiled instantly in Isadora's stomach. Lysandra's voice was deceptively calm as she said, "You have been busy, little sister, working hard to prove to the pack that you are worthy of something you stole from me. I have seen you out there, sweating under the dawn sky, brandishing wooden swords like you actually think you could become the alpha's mate." Isadora squared her shoulders. "I have not stolen anything, Lysandra. The goddess chose to place the mark on me. You think I wanted to humiliate you? To upend your life?" Lysandra's lips curled into a half-snarl. "Maybe not intentionally, but now you seem all too eager to settle into the role, as if you can simply ignore the fact that Darius was mine. The pack was mine to lead by his side." Isadora inhaled, fighting to keep her voice level. "I do not ignore it. I am fully aware of your loss, but I cannot return what was never mine to give. You are angry at me for something neither of us controlled." A cold fire burned in Lysandra's eyes. "But you can remove yourself from the pack, or from his path, or from my sight. You could do something other than this pathetic attempt at training. Instead, you cling to him, to that cursed bond, and pretend you might go strong enough to replace me." Isadora wanted to protest, but she also recognized a twisted logic in Lysandra's words. Part of her had wondered if leaving, if disappearing, might be the only way to restore Lysandra's rightful place. But would that not be spitting in the face of the goddess's command? And would it not merely shift the pain onto the pack as they grappled with the chaos of a bond ignored? She remained silent for a moment, struggling between guilt and defiance, until Lysandra balked a humorless laugh. "You are more stubborn than I expected. Fine, have it your way. But do not assume I will sit back while you steal everything that was meant to be mine. I know how to rally allies, and I know how to make you regret ever letting Darius's mark touch your skin." Isadora's pulse thudded, her wolf stirring up a threat. Her voice trembled, but she stood firm. "Are you seriously threatening me, your own sister, over a bond I did not choose? Our father is worried you might sabotage the pack's unity, but it sounds like that is exactly what you plan to do." A dark smirk tugged at Lysandra's lips. "I am not so foolish as to cause open chaos, but there are ways to shift opinions, to manipulate events, especially if the alpha remains torn. You do not have enough strength or cunning to stand against me. Not now, not ever. You were always in my shadow, and you will remain so until you give up or are forced out." Isadora's wolf snarled inside her mind, an internal surge of defiance. Yet she forced herself to speak calmly. "I do not want a war with you, Lysandra. We are family. Surely we could find—" But Lysandra cut her off with a hiss, stepping closer. "We ceased to be family the moment you took what was mine. I have nothing else to say." Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing ominously in the silent corridor. Isadora let out a shaky exhale, shoulders trembling with adrenaline and heartbreak. Lysandra's hatred was so fierce that it felt like a physical force pressing in on her. She pressed her palm against the mate mark, noticing that its glow seemed to pulse more intensely, as though responding to her fear. She felt the strangest urge to run, but also to fight, to stand her ground. She knew she had made a choice to step into the role the goddess had given her, for better or worse, so she squared her jaw and forced herself to walk to her room. Inside, she sank onto her bed, the events replaying in her mind. She was starting to see how Lysandra might try to undermine her, influencing the pack with rumors, playing up her old ties, or even using cunning tactics to force Isadora to fail in her training. The best she could do was persevere, keep learning, and rely on the growing bond that tethered her to the alpha. In the quiet of her room, she realized with startling clarity that part of her, a part that was growing every day, did not merely want acceptance as Luna for the sake of duty. She wanted it because she was beginning to care deeply for Darius, despite his many reservations. She wanted the chance to stand beside him, to protect him, just as he protected everyone else. If she could gain his trust, maybe she could salvage something from the wreckage left by the moon goddess's unexpected decree. She gazed at the faint swirl of silver etched into her skin, and for the first time allowed a glimmer of hope that, just maybe, she was not the wrong sister for the role. Perhaps the goddess had chosen her for reasons yet to be revealed. Clutching that thought to her heart, Isadora prepared herself for the trials that lay ahead, knowing that Lysandra's enmity was about to intensify, and that the Alpha's reluctant acceptance might be her only sanctuary in a pack that teetered on the edge of chaos. By the time a full week had passed, the undercurrent of tension in the pack was impossible to ignore. Even everyday routines, like distributing supplies or organizing patrol shifts, were fraught with wary glances and hushed speculation. It did not help that Lysandra had strategically begun to spread the word that Isadora was an inadequate replacement, fueling the notion that the Alpha would be weaker with her in his life. Still, Isadora pressed on, deepening her training under Milo's guidance, determined to earn the respect she desperately needed. On a crisp evening that week, preparations were underway for a gathering in the Grand Hall of the Pack House, a traditional monthly event where wolves discussed territory updates, recognized achievements, and addressed any quay. Major grievances. This time, anticipation loomed heavier, as everyone knew the Alpha was scheduled to speak about the disrupted mating ceremony and the direction the pack would take. Rumors abounded that Lysandra would also make an appearance, though no one was sure in what capacity. Isadora felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she readied herself in her room. She had chosen a simple yet elegant gown of deep burgundy, hoping to project calm composure, though anxiety thrummed in her veins. When she finally emerged into the corridor leading to the Grand Hall, she found Pippa waiting for her, an encouraging light in her eyes. "You look lovely," Pippa said softly, walking alongside her. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Isadora admitted, adjusting the fall of her hair. "Darius is going to address the pack. I have no idea if he plans to formally acknowledge me as his mate, or keep avoiding that question. And Lysandra, well, anything could happen." Pippa patted her arm in sympathy. "You have done your part, Isadora. You have worked hard in training. You have listened to the elders. Do not let Lysandra's manipulations overshadow your progress. Let the pack see who you really are." Isadora inhaled deeply, thinking of all the hours she spent wielding wooden blades, running laps around the training grounds, and studying pack politics in the archives. The bond humming in her blood made her hyper-aware of Darius somewhere ahead in the crowd. With determination, she walked forward, stepping into the large space. The grand hall was a marvel of polished wooden floors and tall columns strewn with lanterns. Wolves from various ranks had gathered, forming clusters of conversation that buzzed in the high-ceilinged room. Many paused to watch Isadora as she entered. Some quickly turned away to whisper, while others offered guarded nods. She forced herself to stand tall, ignoring the insecurities that fluttered in her belly. Scanning the gathering, she saw Darius at the far end, near a raised platform used for speeches. He was deep in conversation with Beta Milo and a few elders. Dressed in a dark shirt and tailored pants, he looked every bit the commanding Alpha. Her pulse sped up, the maid bond thrumming once more. She made her way through the throng, exchanging polite greetings where she could. A wave of relief washed over her when she spotted her mother, Mallory, and her father, Pierce, standing together. Their faces eased into kind smiles at her approach. Mallory gently touched her shoulder. "Stay near us if you feel overwhelmed. The atmosphere is charged tonight." Isadora nodded gratefully, but her parents had responsibilities of their own, so she continued on. Just then, a hush fell in the crowd as Darius, flanked by Milo, moved onto the platform. The Alpha scanned the assembled wolves with the cool assurance befitting his station. "Thank you all for gathering this evening," he began, his voice carrying across the hall. "We have much to discuss, including routine updates on border patrols and resource allotments. But first, I know many of you are eager for clarity regarding the disrupted mating ceremony and the status of the purr. Blodro's family. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Isadora's heart thumped hard against her ribcage. She could feel Lysandra's presence, though she had not yet spotted her sister. She remained near the edge of a column for a measure of security, trying to keep her composure. Darius continued, expression grave. As you all know, the goddess bestowed the mate mark upon Isadora Bloodrose, not Lysandra. On the night we all gathered for the union, this was unforeseen, contradicting the careful arrangements made between our families. However, a fated bond cannot be simply brushed aside. Over the past days, I have been prayed. In consultations with the elders, with my advisors, and with the Bloodrose family. For now, I declare that the pack will recognize Isadora as my fated mate. She will undergo training, engage in pack duties, and prepare for the potential role of Luna. This does not mean that I have conclusively embraced the bond, but I will not attempt any ritual to sever it. We will abide by the goddess's mark. An unsettled murmur spread through the onlookers at his words. Some faces displayed relief, others doubt, and still others hardened in disappointment. Isadora felt an odd mixture of gratitude and lingering hurt. He had basically offered tacit acceptance, yet he had still withheld true approval, framing it more as an ongoing test. Nonetheless, it was a step forward from the hostility he had once expressed. Just as the noise began to subside, another voice cut through the hall, sending a ripple of shock that silenced the crowd once more. Your acceptance is premature, Alpha. Isadora turned to see Lysandra stepping forward with regal poise. She was dressed in a sleek outfit that accentuated her fierce confidence, and her gold hair glinted in the lantern light. A swirl of conflicting emotions rushed through Isadora, especially when she saw some of the crowd part for Lysandra with almost deferential respect. Darius's eyes narrowed. Lysandra, I have spoken. We will abide by the bond. Why would that be premature? Lysandra ascended a few steps onto the platform, facing Darius squarely. Because I do not believe Isadora is fit to be your mate. She has spent a handful of days training, which hardly makes her able to protect or guide this pack. You were meant to be with me, and the entire pack knows it. The fact that fate played a cruel trick does not mean we must follow blindly, especially if it brings the pack to ruin. A tension crackled in the air. Isadora's face grew hot as she felt dozens of eyes flicking from Lysandra to her. She forced herself to remain still, though inside she felt the urgent stirring of her wolf. Part of her wanted to shout her newfound resolve, to proclaim she was not so fragile. But Darius spoke first, stepping closer to Lysandra with measured calm. I understand you feel betrayed, Lysandra. None of this was of my choosing, but the mate mark is sacred. The pack's traditions honor it above any personal arrangement. How can you stand before them and claim we should ignore it? Lysandra's gaze swept over the crowd. I am not saying we should dismiss the goddess's sign, but is it possible that the goddess tests you, Alpha, to see if you will choose the stronger alliance or be swayed by a mere accident of fate? We revere the mate bond, yes, but does that mean we hand the pack's future to one who cannot bear it? Our people deserve a Luna who commands respect, not a timid shadow who has only recently emerged from Gra. From Qua. Obscurity. A murmur of agreement rose from a small pocket of supporters near the side. Isadora recognized a few elders who had always admired Lysandra's prowess. Anger and hurt churned in Isadora's stomach. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice seemed caught in her throat. Then, to her surprise, Darius glanced her way and inclined his head, silently prompting her to stand beside him. She gathered her courage and stepped onto the platform, ascending until she stood near both of them. The clashing energy in the air left her breathless. The Alpha turned to Isadora. You have heard Lysandra's challenge. She doubts your readiness, your strength, and many here share that doubt. We have seen you training, but is that enough? Isadora's hand trembled at her side. Every gaze fixed upon her. The bond pulsed, reminding her of why she was here, of the moment when that silver swirl had appeared beneath the moonlight. She realized that if she did not fight now, she would forever remain in Lysandra's shadow. Slowly, she drew in a deep breath and squared her shoulders, letting her voice ring across the hall. I know I was not the wolf anyone expected to stand beside the Alpha. I know that Lysandra is accomplished in ways I am not. But the mate bond is not some random accident. It is the goddess's will. It chose me, and I will not disrespect that by slinking away. I have trained harder than I ever have in my life these past days, and I will continue to work until I am worthy in your eyes. I may not wield Lysandra's strength in a fight, but there are other qualities a Luna can bring to the pack: empathy, wisdom, and the ability to unify. That is what I offer, and with time, my combat skills will grow as well. Lysandra's lips twisted. That is all well and good, little sister. But you and I both know that talk is cheap. This pack needs a Luna who can stand on her own when threats arise. Words will not protect our borders or our people. A flicker of desperation lit Isadora's chest. She took another breath, and before she could doubt herself, she spoke. Then let me prove that I can stand. Challenge me, Lysandra, if that is what it takes. A formal contest, observed by the pack and recognized by the elders. If I lose, I will cede any claim to being Luna and let you take your rightful place. But if I win, you must accept the goddess's decision. No more plots. No more trying to convince the pack that this bond is a mistake. A stunned silence descended. The grand hall, moments ago filled with pockets of chatter, now felt as if time itself had paused. Even Lysandra seemed momentarily taken aback by Isadora's sudden boldness. Isadora felt her heart pounding like a drum, but she held her sister's gaze. There was no turning back from this. Lysandra's eyes flashed with anticipation. She glanced at Darius, then back at Isadora. You would challenge me to a fight or some sort of competition? Do you realize the depth of the skill gap between us? Isadora's throat went dry, but she steeled herself. I understand it better than you think, but if you claim you are the more deserving mate, then prove it by besting me in front of the pack. If I am as weak and unworthy as you say, then you should have no trouble defeating me and proving that I am not fit to lead. A dark, predatory grin curved Lysandra's lips, revealing a glimpse of the wolf within. Careful, sister, that your courage does not lead you to a humiliating downfall. Very well. I accept your challenge. We will hold this contest 3 days from now, at midday, in the training yard. I look forward to reminding everyone why I was always the stronger heir of the Bloodross line. An excited and nervous murmur swept through the hall. Several onlookers exchanged wide-eyed glances, sensing the gravity of what had just been sealed. Darius's gaze shifted between the two sisters, tension evident in his posture. Finally, he raised a hand to silence the crowd. So be it. This is highly irregular, but so is our situation. The elders will oversee the contest. We will determine the exact conditions. Let it be known, the victor's claim will be recognized by the pack. Lysandra bowed her head, a mocking glimmer in her eyes. I await our duel, sister. Then she turned sharply on her heel and swept out of the hall, taking a small contingent of her supporters with her. A wave of whispers broke out among the remaining wolves as Darius addressed the more mundane aspects of the pack's business. Isadora stood in a haze of apprehension, wondering if she had sealed her own fate. The thrumming of her heartbeat seemed to blot out the voices around her. She only stirred from her daze when Pippa appeared at her side, eyes wide. "Are you out of your mind?" her friend whispered, half admiring, half horrified. "You challenged Lysandra, one of the best fighters in the region." Isadora's fingers curled into her skirt, but her resolve did not waver. "I had no choice, Pip. She would never stop undermining me unless I stand up to her. If I fail, so be it. I will let her have what she wants. But if there is even a chance to prove that the bond is not a fluke, I have to take it." Pippa bit her lip, then threw an arm around Isadora. "Well, I will be cheering you on. You have guts, that's for sure." As Darius concluded the pack meeting, many wolves started to disperse, still chattering about the contest. Isadora watched him step down from the platform, the fluid strength in his movement reminding her how formidable an alpha could be. She caught his gaze from across the room, and though his face was guarded, she sensed an undercurrent of concern. He nodded for her to follow him, then made his way through a side door that led into a quieter hallway. She slipped away from the throng, heart pounding anew, and found him waiting under a low lantern. His expression was neither approving nor angry, but coiled with tension. He cut straight to the point. "Why did you do that? Challenge Lysandra publicly? Do you have any idea how dangerous she can be when cornered?" She sighed, still trembling inside from the enormity of her decision. "Yes, I do. But you heard her. She will never accept me unless I prove myself in the most direct way. I have been training. Maybe it is not enough, but I cannot let her keep undermining your leadership and mine." He pressed his lips together. "I appreciate the spirit, but I question the timing. You have scarcely a few days to prepare before you face someone who has been training her entire life to be a top-tier fighter. There is no easy outcome here." She tilted her chin up, trying to quell her fears. "I know, but it is done. I will give it everything. If I fail, at least we can move on. If I succeed, perhaps we can finally put this conflict to rest." For a moment his gaze softened, as though he glimpsed the vulnerable determination that fueled her. "You have more courage than I expected," he murmured. "I will have Milo intensify your training, but do not think for one moment that Lysandra will go easy on you. She might not try to kill you, but she will aim to humiliate you completely in front of the entire pack." Isadora swallowed, a wave of nausea rolling through her, but she nodded firmly. "I understand. I have made my choice." Darius studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Very well. Meet Milo in the yard at sunrise. We will see what you are truly made of." She watched him walk away, shoulders taut with conflict. Her heart panged at the knowledge that, despite everything, she wanted to earn not only the pack's respect, but also Darius's esteem, possibly even his affection. The next 3 days promised to be a crucible that would test her in ways she never imagined. She could all but hear Lysandra sharpening her claws. Whether she rose or fell would change the fate of the Silver Dawn pack. Breathing in the charged air of the corridor, she mustered her courage and retreated to her room to rest, her mind already churning with the steep challenge looming ahead. The day of the contest arrived with a sky of brilliant blue, as though the moon goddess had chosen to grant them a day of clarity for whatever outcome might unfold. From dawn onward, the training yard bustled with activity, as warriors, elders, and curious onlookers gathered, eager for what many deemed the most riveting confrontation in years. Isadora stood at the edge of the yard, adjusting the lightweight leather padding Milo had given her. Beside her, Pippa fussed over the ties, ensuring everything was properly secured. "I am so nervous for you, I can barely breathe," Pippa whispered. "You remember everything Milo taught you, right? The sequences for defense, how to read an opponent's stance, all that?" Isadora nodded, though her stomach felt like a knot of serpents. "Yes, I do. But Lysandra's speed and power are no joke. I just have to hope that my training can compensate for her experience, at least enough to avoid a crushing defeat." From across the yard, a cluster of onlookers shifted to reveal Lysandra, dressed in sleek training leathers dyed a deep crimson, her expression unwavering. Her supporters chatted excitedly in hushed tones, clearly expecting her to dominate. Isadora took a steadying breath and walked toward the center of the yard. A makeshift ring had been marked with chalk. Elder Jonas, bearing a stern, formal mien, stood at its edge, ready to officiate. Darius and Beta Milo were stationed off to one side, their stances radiating authority. The Alpha's gaze locked on Isadora the moment she stepped forward. She could sense his concern, though he remained outwardly composed. When both sisters stood at the center, Jonas lifted his hands for quiet. "We gather here under the watchful eye of the goddess to witness a challenge. Isadora Bloodrose has called for a contest to prove her worthiness as the Alpha's fated mate, while Lysandra Bloodrose contests that she herself is the rightful partner, having been promised to Alpha Darius before the bond was revealed. By our laws, a sanctioned trial of skill can offer clarity when the pack is divided." Lysandra, face impassive, surveyed the crowd, then leveled her gaze at her sister. Isadora breathed in carefully. She scanned the ring, noting the sand underfoot, the boundary lines, and the early morning light streaming across their designated field of combat. Elder Jonas gestured to a crate holding 2 short wooden swords that approximated the weight of real steel blades. "Your weapons," he said solemnly. "Magic has no place in this ring. Only your skill, strength, and cunning will determine the outcome. The victor is decided if one yields or is incapacitated." Both sisters selected a sword. The wood felt reassuringly firm in Isadora's grip, though her palms were damp with sweat. She flexed her shoulders, recalling Milo's countless instructions about stance and footwork. Elder Jonas stepped back, eyes flicking between them. "The challenge commences on my signal. May the goddess grant clarity to us all." He raised his hand, paused, and then brought it sharply downward. "Begin!" Lysandra wasted no time. She sprang forward, sword whistling through the air in a powerful overhead strike. Isadora sidestepped, lifting her own blade in a parry that barely diverted the blow. The impact jarred her arms, reminding her of the difference in their strength. Lysandra pressed forward, launching another barrage of quick strikes. Isadora scrambled to block or dodge, focusing on not losing her footing. Each swing from Lysandra was precise, carrying lethal intent. The crowd watched in rapt silence, occasionally erupting in gasps when a strike came close to landing. Within moments, Isadora realized she could not match her sister's raw power. She had to rely on agility, on reading the patterns of Lysandra's movements. Milo's voice echoed in her memory. "Stay light on your feet, let them come to you, and strike when they are off balance." As Lysandra lunged again, Isadora shifted her weight and sidestepped, aiming a quick thrust at Lysandra's unguarded flank. For the first time, she felt the jarring contact of her wooden blade striking home. Lysandra hissed and spun away, but the brief opening reminded Isadora that victory, though improbable, was not impossible. A chorus of exclamations swept through the watchers. Some of Lysandra's supporters muttered in surprise, while others glared daggers at Isadora. Darius remained stone-faced, though his eyes gleamed with keen attentiveness. Isadora had no time to dwell on whether that flash in his gaze was pride or anxiety, as Lysandra wasted no time launching another attack. They circled each other, sand kicking up underfoot, swords clacking with every fierce exchange. Sweat glistened on both of them, and Isadora realized, to her astonishment, that her earlier training sessions had boosted her stamina far more than she expected. She was not yet winded, while Lysandra's breaths were coming heavier after a series of failed strikes. But Lysandra was too seasoned to be shaken by a single hit. She switched tactics, feinting a left slash that forced Isadora to overcommit, then pivoting to deliver a painful strike to Isadora's upper arm. A yelp escaped Isadora as pain burned along her biceps, and she nearly dropped her sword. The crowd groaned in unison, sensing a decisive shift. Lysandra followed up instantly, pressing Isadora back with a whirlwind of blows. Each block jarred Isadora's wounded arm, the dull ache intensifying until it threatened to overwhelm her focus. She let out a desperate growl, willing herself to keep her guard up. Despite her best efforts, Lysandra managed to drive Isadora closer to the perimeter of the ring. With a quick flick of her wrist, Lysandra knocked Isadora's sword aside. Seizing the opening, she aimed a strike that could have struck Isadora's ribs with punishing force. At the last second, Isadora twisted, evading by a hair's breadth. She stumbled, nearly toppling out of the marked boundary. The crowd buzzed with tension, sensing how close she had come to defeat. Breathing hard, she forced herself to straighten, ignoring the fierce burn in her arm. Their eyes locked, and Isadora caught a glimpse of Lysandra's triumph. "Just give up," Lysandra growled, low enough for only Isadora to hear. "You cannot best me. Yield and walk away before I make an example of you." For a moment, Isadora wavered, her battered arms screaming for her to drop her blade. Then she glanced at the faint silver glow shining around her mate mark. The reminder of the goddess's will reignited her courage. Her mind flashed with all she stood to lose: the chance to secure her place, to protect Darius from the pack's division, to uphold her bond. She snarled back, mustering a reservoir of will she did not know she possessed. "I will not yield." Gathering her resolve, Isadora lunged, switching from a purely defensive posture to a new, more unpredictable approach. She recalled a combination Milo had drilled into her the previous day, a series of feints that relied on shifting her weight in unexpected ways. The first slash was deflected by Lysandra, but then Isadora pivoted her footwork and aimed a lower strike at Lysandra's thigh. Lysandra dodged, but not quickly enough, and the wooden sword clipped her leg. Lysandra faltered, stunned that Isadora had managed to tag her again. Sensing an opening, Isadora pressed forward with a swift jab to Lysandra's midsection. Though Lysandra blocked it, the momentum forced her to stagger a step backward. A flurry of exchanges followed, each sister landing shallow hits, each refusing to give ground. The onlookers could scarcely believe how closely matched they seemed. Lysandra was clearly stronger, but Isadora's agility and refusal to yield brought them to a standstill again and again. The tension in the air crackled, culminating in a climactic clash where both swords locked together. They stood mere inches apart, muscles straining, sweat soaking through their clothes. It was an almost surreal stillness, broken by ragged breathing and the press of wood against wood. Locked in that straining position, Lysandra stared into Isadora's eyes, her lip curled in a snarl. "You can fight, but you will never lead," she hissed. With a sharp twist of her blade, Lysandra broke the stalemate, slamming her elbow into Isadora's chest. The blow drove the air from Isadora's lungs and sent her stumbling backward. She barely managed to keep her footing, reeling from the impact. Her vision flickered with black spots, and it felt like her chest was caving in. Sensing her advantage, Lysandra closed in with a final push. Isadora raised her sword in a desperate defense, but her arms felt like lead. The harsh taste of defeat swirled in her mouth. Time seemed to slow as Lysandra swung an overhead blow that would end the match. In a surge of sheer survival, Isadora tapped into her wolf side, drawing on the primal instincts she usually kept subdued. She dove sideways, letting Lysandra's downward strike smash into the sand, sending grit flying. Rolling to her knees, Isadora spun and slashed at Lysandra's exposed back. The wood connected with a jarring thud. Lysandra let out a cry of pain, stunned by the unorthodox move. An explosion of gasps and exclamations filled the yard. Seizing the moment, Isadora whipped around to face Lysandra as she staggered, then launched a follow-up strike at the older sister's shoulder. The blow connected, forcing Lysandra to drop her blade with a growl of frustration. Isadora's own weapon trembled in her hands, half from adrenaline, half from the throbbing pain in her limbs. She swallowed hard, sword raised, poised to deliver a final blow if Lysandra retaliated. But Lysandra sank to her knees, panting, sweat drenching her face. She glared at Isadora with raw, seething rage, but the sword lay abandoned in the sand. For a long moment, the entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Elder Jonas stepped forward, eyes flicking from Lysandra's prone form to Isadora's trembling stance. Finally, he lifted his voice. Lysandra Bloodrose has lost her weapon. Unless she can continue, the match is over. A hush settled, and every gaze bored into the kneeling sister, waiting to see if she would rise for more. But Lysandra's eyes slid shut, her face twisted in defeat and hatred. She lifted her hands in a resigned gesture. "I yield," she spat, bitterness dripping from each syllable. The tension broke like a dam, and the crowd's reaction was immediate. Some cheered in shock and exhilaration, while others stared in open disbelief. Isadora's legs nearly gave out. She let her wooden sword drop to the sand, mind whirling in exhausted astonishment. She had won, however narrowly, yet it felt like a dream. She looked to the sidelines, where she saw Milo clapping with a proud grin, and Pippa jumping up and down with tears in her eyes. Her parents stood together, relief etched in their faces. Then her gaze landed on Darius, whose eyes were locked on her with a mixture of surprise, respect, and something deeper that made her heart flutter despite the throbbing pain coursing through her body. Elder Jonas raised his arms to quiet the crowd. In accordance with the rules of the challenge, Isadora is the victor. By her own stipulation, she has proven her fitness to stand beside the Alpha as his true mate. Let this dispute be settled under the eye of the goddess. A roar of approval erupted from the onlookers who favored the mate bond, mingled with scattered grumbling from Lysandra's supporters. Isadora exhaled, noticing just how unsteady her legs felt. Her chest still ached from Lysandra's strike, and her arm pounded where she had been hit. Yet she remained upright, an unstoppable flood of relief coursing through her veins. She blinked away tears. She had done what she set out to do, even if it felt like she had skirted the razor's edge of defeat. Lysandra rose shakily, wiping sweat from her brow. She spared Isadora a look filled with fury. "This doesn't change the fact that the pack would be stronger with me," she muttered, so low that only Isadora could hear. Then she turned and limped away into the crowd, a trail of supporters hurrying after her. Isadora swallowed, sympathy and residual fear swirling inside her. She doubted Lysandra would concede gracefully for long, but at least for this moment, the pack's law was satisfied. Darius stepped forward, his posture laced with alpha confidence. The crowd gave him space, and he approached Isadora, eyes dark with an unreadable intensity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he gently took her hand, lifting it so that the sunlight shone on the swirling mate mark. She felt warmth flood her at his touch, the electric hum of the bond quickening. He glanced around at the watching crowd, then returned his gaze to Isadora. Slowly he bent and pressed his lips to the back of her hand, acknowledging her victory in a gesture that sent a thrill through every nerve in her body. "Isadora," he said, voice pitched so only she could hear, "I may have doubted you, but you have proved me wrong today. Your strength is undeniable." There was a subtle crack in his usual aloof armor, a tenderness glimmering beneath the surface. She met his gaze, her heart hammering, hardly believing that they stood together in the aftermath of such a fierce battle. Applause and conversation swirled around them, but all she could focus on was the unspoken acceptance radiating from him. A short while later, Elder Jonas announced a brief pause before the day's normal training would resume, allowing onlookers to disperse. Immediately, Pippa and Milo rushed over, congratulating Isadora with excited hugs. Her parents arrived too, proud tears in her mother's eyes, her father offering quiet words of admiration. Darius stood by, speaking with a few of the high-ranked wolves, who expressed both shock and approval that he had gained such a formidable mate. Isadora found herself caught up in a whirlwind of emotions, each wave of adrenaline replaced by a flood of relief. Soon, Darius dismissed the others and gently guided Isadora to a smaller courtyard garden on the east side of the pack house, away from the crowds. The space was tranquil, filled with rows of bright flowers that bobbed in the late morning breeze, the graceful arch of a fountain murmuring softly. She leaned against a low stone railing, still catching her breath. He stood close, as though unsure whether to keep distance or wrap her in an embrace. "You fought well," he finally said, brushing a stray lop of hair away from her damp forehead. "I did not expect you to push her so hard. How do you feel?" She laughed breathlessly, a mixture of triumph and pain. "Like my body will remind me of every bruise for weeks. But I am proud that I didn't give in. It felt like I was fighting for more than just my reputation." His gaze softened. "You are fighting for us, for this bond. I see that now. My wolf senses it too. We are more aligned than I realized. If you had lost, I would have had to abide by the pack's verdict, but I suspect my wolf would never have. Forgiven me. Why?" She felt a twinge of relief. "So you're saying you accept the mate bond now? No more talk of breaking it?" He let out a long exhale. "Yes. I still need time to reconcile all of this. But I cannot deny what the goddess has shown us. You have proven your determination. You endured my doubt, Lysandra's fury, and the entire pack's judgment, yet you still stand. That is worthy of respect, and more." Her heart soared at his words. She sensed that he was not simply yielding out of obligation, but genuinely coming to terms with her as his mate. The tension in his shoulders eased, and he reached out, taking her uninjured arm and drawing her a step closer. The swirl of the bond pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and for a moment she felt like everything else in the world had faded, leaving only the two of them in that sun-kissed garden. Then, in a gesture that spoke more than any words could, Darius leaned down, pressing his lips softly against hers. The kiss was tinged with tentative exploration, as though they were both unsure of this new closeness, yet it carried a current of promise and deep recognition. She trembled at the contact, every nerve alight with the meaning of the moment. They stood there, the world around them a blur, sealed by the affirmation of the bond the goddess had forced upon them weeks ago. Now, it seemed they were finally choosing each other, forging a delicate path toward unity. When they pulled back, breath intermingling, Isadora realized tears shone in her eyes. She remembered the swirl of events that had brought them to this point, the humiliating ceremony that had never been finished, Lysandra's anger, the disbelief from every corner. Yet the mark on her hand glowed with renewed brightness, as though the goddess herself approved of their acceptance. Darius cupped her cheek, exhaling softly. "We will have to deal with Lysandra's resentment, and the pack will need time to adjust, but I will stand beside you now. We shall lead together, and I will protect you from any threat, internal or external. Wa." She placed her hand over his, gratitude and love swirling within her. "And I will protect you too, Darius, in any way I can. That is what a mate is supposed to do." A warmth that had nothing to do with the sun spread through her at the sense of genuine partnership taking root. Their bond was no longer just an accident of fate, it was something they were shaping into a foundation for themselves and the Silver Dawn pack. They stood quietly for a few minutes, letting the magnitude of the day settle in, occasionally exchanging tender touches. The garden's fountain gurgled, and the world seemed, for that fleeting moment, at peace. But they both knew the days ahead would be fraught with challenges. Lysandra's defeat might temporarily silence her immediate claims, but Isadora did not believe her sister's rage would vanish so easily. The pack would accept the outcome of the trial, yet there would still be hearts that favored Lysandra or doubted Isadora's readiness to be Luna. Darius himself was only just beginning to open to the bond, and they would have to navigate building trust and a true partnership. None of that daunted Isadora now. She had faced her sister's blade in open combat, and she had persevered. With Darius beside her, she felt she could stand against the storms that threatened to tear them apart. As they finally returned to the pack house, hand in hand, Pippa saw them and grinned widely, while Milo gave a respectful nod of approval. Some wolves whispered, but others bowed their heads in acknowledgement of the alpha's chosen mate. In that moment, Isadora felt the shift from being an outcast to being recognized, if not fully embraced, as the future Luna. The path was still lined with obstacles, but she believed that perhaps this was what the moon goddess had intended all along, to force an unexpected twist, challenging everyone's preconceived notions. Out of that turmoil came a deeper truth, one that could unite the pack in ways no one anticipated. That night, as twilight settled across the Silver Dawn pack, Isadora found herself standing on the wide balcony adjacent to Darius's suite, the same place that had been intended for Lysandra's wedding preparations. Only a few short weeks ago, soft moonlight bathed the landscape in silver hues. She felt Darius approach, his presence as magnetic as ever. He slipped an arm around her waist, quietly absorbing the view of the darkened forests and rolling hills beyond the territory borders. In the distance, a wolf's howl resonated, a haunting melody that spoke of longing and belonging. Isadora leaned into Darius's warmth, listening to the rhythmic beat of his heart against her ear. Her mind wandered back to the girl she had been before all of this, shy, overshadowed, content to stay in the background. That girl was gone. In her place was someone who had grappled with doubt, fear, and heartbreak, yet had chosen to fight for a destiny she never asked for, but now claimed as her own. Darius pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, his voice a low rumble. "Tomorrow we will speak with the elders about hosting a formal acceptance ceremony for us. It will not be like the one we had planned with Lysandra, but something new, something that acknowledges what we have endured. Are you ready for that? A surge of quiet determination filled her. Yes, we will do it our way, in our time. He nodded, pulling her closer. She could sense the tension still simmering beneath his surface, the weight of 1,000 responsibilities, but also a growing sense of conviction. Little by little, the alpha who had once snarled at the mere thought of her was letting her in, surrendering to the unbreakable chain that was their mate bond. As the moon glided higher, they stood there quietly, drawing strength from each other. Perhaps Lysandra, still harboring her bitterness, was out somewhere in the night, brooding over her defeat and planning her next move. Perhaps pockets of the pack still doubted Isadora. But for now, in the hush of moonlight, the bond hummed with promise. She had walked through the fire of her sister's wrath, endured the scathing doubts of the alpha, and emerged not unscathed, but stronger. Her life and her future might be more complicated than she ever dreamed, yet she felt certain that she and Darius stood on the brink of something grand. And so, under the silvery glow of the moon goddess, two fated souls, once at odds, found a measure of harmony. It was not the perfect fairy tale some might have expected, but it was real, forged by conflict, tested by blood, and tempered by the acceptance of a bond they could no longer deny. With the world below them sleeping, Isadora and Darius stood together against the challenges that would come, united at last, bound by fate, yet choosing one another. The final hush of night cradled them, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees carried a single truth across the starlit sky. Though unexpected, they had become one another's destiny, a destiny that no amount of rivalry or misunderstanding could unravel.